Welcome and warning. This podcast is designed for those who like to think outside of the box. It is for entertainment purposes only. You've been warned. Welcome back. This is Anna, aka Mystic Pixie, and I am coming back with another episode of the Consume Her Consumer podcast. So, last couple episodes we did some deep dives into Hollywood, or what I call Hollyweird, and I wanted to go into a Netflix anthology that I revisited. I've watched the series a while back, and it was called the Dirty John series, and there's two separate seasons. I am obsessed with the second season, and it was covering Betty Broderick, and I feel like I want to look at this from a couple of perspectives because I know she gained a lot of national attention after murdering her ex-husband and his second wife. So I want to dig into this a little bit, media portrayals, and then go back a little further to some other media portrayals of another big case that I actually covered back in college for a research paper. So, like I said, I was watching Netflix, watched The Dirty John. I believe ABC actually had the series first, but I watched both. I really liked the Dirty John series. It was really good. But then Betty Broderick, it was just, I felt like they did such a good job with it. And it, it really stirred a lot of emotions in me just because I feel like it covers so much of what women go through. And really in my very first episode of the podcast, I had noted, I listened to everybody throughout the years, and a lot of the women that we knew had really been through something. And it's why my generation was really urged to go to college and make sure we pursued educations and careers. And I want to say that this is one of those cases that explain why. So let's go ahead and dig in. So Betty Broderick, she was born Elizabeth Ann Bisceglia. She was born in 1947. She's a convicted murderer. She's still in prison to this day. She gained a lot of national attention in the late 80s. So the murder actually occurred in 1989. So it was really more early 90s where she was going through trial and everything. And this was for killing her ex-husband, Dan Broderick, and his second wife, Linda Kilkenna Broderick, in their San Diego home. So she had entered their home and she shot both of them. Little background about Betty was Betty grew up in a very strict Irish Catholic family in New York. And I bring this up because this has a lot to do, especially through this time, through the 50s all the way through the 80s. Having this very cultural and religious background definitely played a part in this. She was among a very strict or traditional Catholic shaping, and really that is probably one of the roots of why she internalized so much with this marriage divorce and losing her entire identity around this divorce, really, and then the crime. This was part of the emotional collapse. So I really wanted to bring that up because a lot of the times divorce was really frowned upon at that point, and there weren't really any resources. So she married Dan Broderick in 1969. So Dan ended up later becoming a very successful medical malpractice attorney. Dan and Betty had 4 children together, 2 girls and 2 boys. And during their marriage, Dan pursued law school after he attended medical school. So he went to medical school and then decided to go into law school so that he could pursue medical law. And during those periods of Dan's schooling, Betty worked multiple jobs to raise the family and support the family. So years after their marriage, Dan began an affair with his legal assistant, Linda Kilkenna, and this started in about the early 80s. And the affair was initially denied. Now, this is another piece of this, which we'll get into deeper later. But the divorce was very bitter, and it was highly publicized, and the divorce was finalized in 1989. So I believe earlier 89, and then the murders occurred in late 89. Now, in the late 80s, or even by the 80s, divorce among strict Catholics was very stigmatized, particularly for the woman. Women were often pitied, they were ostracized in their social circles, and you have to remember, part of Dan and Betty's life was this whole social circle and this very elite group, okay? So the message was really clear. If your marriage failed, you were the failure, and that was morally and spiritually for a lot of these women. Someone like Betty had spent 16 years being this good Catholic wife, and the divorce to her was just absolutely humiliating and devastating. It wasn't just losing her husband, she was being completely taken from her sense of self and her community as well. And on top of all that, Betty felt deeply betrayed and financially manipulated because Dan, as she described very often, was the law. So over the years, especially since the affair and then the divorce and the remarriage of Dan, Betty started becoming increasingly unstable, and she ended up doing some things that we'll get into that were just, they come across as very crazy and irrational, but we're going to talk a little bit more why. So Dan was really seen as this very highly American success story. He was known as being very charming, extremely smart. He was well dressed, and something really big at the time, self-made. He graduated from Notre Dame and Harvard. He was known in San Diego's elite legal community for his sharp intellect and his drive and his ambition. And again, he was very charismatic. Socially, he was known as being a very smooth talker, and he looked outwardly like he was very devoted to his family, very image-centric. Now, he embodied the 1980s masculine success. So he had this money, he had confidence, prestige, and control. And it was exactly what many people, including Betty, said became psychologically suffocating to her behind these closed doors. A lot of the descriptions of Dan's emotional abuse from people who admired him professionally have acknowledged that he could be very cold and manipulative. He could be domineering, especially when it came to his marriage. Some consistent descriptions of Dan were that once Dan filed for divorce, he cut Betty's access to money off, even for her basic essential living. And he allegedly gave her an allowance that was far below what she needed to survive, especially for the lifestyle that they had built together. And at one point, he sold their family home, and he only gave her $16,000 of it, despite him having such significant wealth. And I'll break down some of the wealth here in a little bit, but it's important to know that this is kind of a textbook pattern of financial abuse and control when it comes down to breaking down somebody's autonomy, such as Betty's. Dan was known for multiple friends of Betty. Even some of the mutual acquaintances recalled Dan could be very condescending, and he could be very dismissive, especially when it became apparent that Betty was becoming a little emotional. And this was even earlier on. And he would deny the affair with Linda Kilkenna, even whenever it was becoming blatantly obvious. And he would gaslight Betty and say that she was crazy and she was unstable, and say, everybody thinks you're crazy. And again, this is a repeated reality distortion that is recognized as gaslighting as we know today. But at this point, they did not have the words to describe this. Dan was also known to weaponize the legal system at the time. He was a very powerful lawyer, like I said. He was also the former president of the San Diego County Bar Association. So Dan had a tremendous amount of leverage in this divorce and in their community. Again, Betty would often say he was the law. Now, some of her letters and courtroom statements claim that he manipulated filings, he purposefully delayed some of the proceedings, and he used his network to humiliate Betty from their social circles and friendships and such. Now, Dan reportedly refused to communicate with Betty directly, and he would only communicate through their lawyers and their children once the divorce really started turning ugly. And I think a lot of people would probably agree with that today. But at the time, Again, this was somebody that she devoted her entire existence to and helping build through his wealth. So it was really harmful to Betty's psyche. Dan then moved into a house with Linda, who a lot of people described as resembling a younger version of Betty. And he ended up marrying Linda pretty quickly. And Betty was still, at that point, just fighting for some financial fairness in the legal system. And so for Betty, this was also symbolic of replacing her so publicly that was also very psychologically brutal for Betty as well. Now, what other people said, some friends and colleagues, how they would describe Dan was brilliant but ruthless, capable of deep charm, but emotionally detached. One comment even said, Dan could win any argument not because he was right, because he'd make you feel small for trying. Narcissism, guys. Now, as far as the family and children, Kim Broderick, who's the oldest daughter of Dan and Betty, said that Dan could be emotionally withholding, but she doesn't excuse her mother's violence. And I agree with her on that. It's not excusable to murder. But their second daughter was more sympathetic to her mom, and she said that her dad could be a control freak, and he treated her mom more like an employee rather than a partner. Also very, very psychologically damaging. One of their sons described Dan as, he said, my dad wasn't perfect. He could be a jerk. He pushed her buttons for years. So even the children who really loved Dan acknowledged that some of the things that he did provoked Betty, and he really, some of the descriptions also said he would use his power to win at all costs. And another friend had said in a quote, an unnamed family friend quoted in the San Diego Reader, he would smile when twisting the knife. That's who he was. So when we take some of the sensationalism out of this, what I wanted to talk about is Dan's power came from this emotional and systemic dominance. It wasn't physical abuse, okay? This was all psychological, and it was disempowering to Betty. And because society really didn't recognize the patterns of abuse then, Betty's breakdown was just interpreted as her being this mad woman rather than her having this trauma response to something so huge. Now, I did want to look into Linda Kilkenna a little tiny bit, and I didn't get much, but what I did get was she was born in 1961, and she was about 21 years younger than Dan. She started off as a receptionist in the legal firm and then became a paralegal in the same firm. And it was reported that she had no formal legal training, and that rubbed some of their colleagues the wrong way as well. Some friends had described her as bubbly, outspoken, strong-willed, and flirtatious. But by the mid-1980s, Betty suspected Dan was having an affair with Linda, and Dan repeatedly denied this to Betty. And as it was escalating, Betty's anger started to escalate. But to outsiders, they were making it look more like paranoia, when even the people in the office with Linda and Dan would say Linda was sending him gifts. She would accompany them to work events even before Dan and Betty's divorce was finalized. And when Betty confronted her, Linda was said to have mocked her. Now, this is debatable, okay? This is a lot through Betty's testimony, which may or may not have been true. So take that one with a grain of salt. But things that did emerge through testimony and interviews, and also Bella Stumbo, her journalism. So just really quick, Bella Stumbo, she was an investigative journalist, and she was a feature writer who, unlike most of the tabloids and the news media, did not sensationalize this. Bella treated Betty as more of an examination of how privilege, patriarchy, religion, and the psychological collapse intersected with Betty's case. She treated Betty more like a human without excusing Betty's actions. Again, murder is not right. That's not okay. But Bella ended up writing this book, and it really gave a depiction of what was really kind of going on with Betty at the time. So what was said is that some of the professionals would say some coworkers described Linda as playful and flirtatious, but she was not shy at all about her attraction to Dan. People said she was confident but defiant, and she was the face of gossip in the office. And that attitude both impressed and angered a lot of the people around her in this whole case and in the office. And a few have said that she was kind of sassy, and she could rub somebody like Betty the wrong way easily. And Betty was already feeling replaced and humiliated, so it just was almost cruel. A quote from a former coworker was, "Linda had a way of walking into the room like she owned it. She wasn't cruel, but she didn't hide it either." So I wanted to just kind of dig into what people were saying about Dan and Linda, just so we had a little background about them as well. Again, not excusing murder whatsoever, but during the divorce, the accounts kind of diverge whether Linda taunted Betty or not. Some say that she sent Betty a wedding invitation to Betty's house, and then Betty was eventually forced out of the same house. Some were saying that she would leave. Betty claims that Linda sent her a note that said, "Eat your heart out, you can't have him." However, there was never really any proof of this, and this was really during the period of Betty's spiral. So they insisted Linda didn't initiate contact. Some were saying that the inner circle was saying Linda did not initiate anything with Betty, but they did say that Betty was the one who called repeatedly. She would leave these vulgar voice messages on the answering machine, and then she even vandalized their property. In one case, she smeared cake all over their bed. So she had entered the home and smeared cake all over their bed. And then in another, she rammed her car right into the front door of their home. Near the end, Linda was reported as saying that she asked Dan to get a restraining order and saying that she couldn't relax knowing that Betty was still this angry. Betty kind of saw Linda as the provocateur, but Linda seemed to have avoided the direct confrontation, especially in the later stages. So even if Linda didn't literally taunt Betty, her existence in and of itself was a reflection of Betty's old life, right? So she moved into Betty's home. She used Betty's furniture, her social circle, even down to her linens. And when she married Dan in the same house, this really symbolically erased Betty in her social world, right? And that drove a lot of the rage. Again, not excusing it, but let's try to see it from an understanding perspective if it were you. The public perception at the time, in the late 80s, the media portrayed Linda as this perfect younger version of Betty, and she was not volatile, she was pretty, and she was calm. And a lot of it was just the way that the media portrayed Betty was that she was this crazy ex-wife. And some claim Linda was a temptress. Both women were really kind of trapped in this patriarchal morality play with Dan, right? So even though, unfortunately Linda sadly lost her life, and that's horrible, she too was probably sort of a victim to Dan in a way, especially with the descriptions of him. And if he saw Linda as a way of looking younger, and, it gave him a little prestige having this younger wife too, kind of updating the model. But in hindsight, if we really look at these cultural norms, Betty was really discarded, and she was the one who helped Dan build this whole entire empire to begin with. And Linda was just kind of this shiny new prize that validated Dan's success. Again, further just inflaming Betty's rage. And when you really look at it, neither of these women had full power. Now, when it comes down to the Catholic roots, Betty, in a letter excerpt, said, "I was raised to believe marriage was forever. Divorce was a sin. I did everything I was supposed to, and I was thrown away." A friend quoted to Bella Stumbo in the book Until the 12th of Never, "She was Catholic to her bones. Divorce wasn't something she could process. It wasn't in her programming." So these are all really, really, really important things to remember when considering all of the things that were going on for Betty at this time as well. Now, if you would look at it from modern times, I find this really fascinating because we have words to describe a lot of these things. Now, Betty didn't, and society didn't. This was not just about Betty. My whole point of this is so many women experience this on such a smaller scale. But this also shaped why women my age were so forced into thinking they had to get a degree and they had to go to work, and why that whole housewife role has been really stripped down as not being as valuable. And I just find this so fascinating because a lot of this is really what ended up shaping me as a woman as well. A lot of the things would say Linda wasn't intentionally provoking Betty, but she didn't fully grasp the trauma that she was stepping into. She walked into a really volatile triangle. Dan was really a narcissist, and psychologically, Betty was unraveling, and the social system didn't really help any of this emotional abuse at the time. So, as I said, Betty ended up entering the home of Dan and Linda in 1989, and she was convicted in 1991 of 2 counts of second-degree murder for killing both Dan and Linda. She was up for parole a few times already, and in 2010, her first parole hearing, she was denied parole because the board said she showed no remorse in her actions, and she continued to try to justify these murders. Then again in 2017, there was a second hearing, and again she was denied, and the board noted that she remains an unreasonable risk to society as she's still rationalizing her actions. Her next parole hearing was to be around 2032. She'll be in her 80s at that point. Betty will likely just remain in prison through her death. Current day, Betty is now in her 70s, and reports suggest she still writes letters and maintains the versions of events. Like I said, even at the parole hearing, she was still continuing to maintain it, but that she was emotionally abused and pushed beyond her limits. That part is probably true, but there's still some accountability that needs to be held. Murder, again, is not okay. Some of the cultural impacts of this is she became the symbol of divorce gone wrong, and it really raised this public debate about emotional abuse, women's rights, and then mental health. And it inspired a couple movies. The TV movie A Woman Scorned, the Betty Broderick story, and that came out in 1992. Now, guys, this starred Meredith Baxter. I believe she was the mom from Family Ties, if anybody remembers that. But what's important to understand is, like, when I saw that this came out in 92 and she was only convicted in 91, it reminded me of how many made-for-TV movies came out almost immediately at that time, and it shaped our public perception of how events went down for pretty much everything. And that's so concerning to me because if we look back at, if anybody follows the Menendez brothers trials, you know, there were a couple made-for-TV movies, and I remember watching them as a kid and being like, boy, these 2 kids were horrible. But when you hear the backstory and you see everything that's coming out now, while murder, again, is wrong and some of their behaviors were really odd, the media really shaped us into thinking that they were full-blown monsters when in reality, there might have been other things going on that weren't able to be described at the time, or were very stigmatized, or things that people just wouldn't even talk about. So that's something important to remember about the Meredith Baxter version of this. I did go back and watch it, and I think it does kind of go pretty similarly to the Netflix and USA series, the Dirty John series. Guys, if you haven't seen it, Amanda Peet plays Betty and Christian Slater plays Dan, and they knock it out of the park. They do a great job on this one. But I do think Christian Slater nails kind of that sort of smooth arrogance of a narcissist, and he plays that role beautifully. But I'm also a Christian Slater fan, so it's important to know, though, this case is so personal culturally to people, especially women who were quietly enduring the same thing during this era. And then the media played this huge role. And when we look at it, the media really uses the gender dynamic to shape the public perception. It's interesting to kind of look back at how many things over the years we've seen in a movie form, and it ended up being so sensationalized, right? So Betty was slowly unraveling, like we said, but Betty was not crazy from like a psychosis standpoint. she was really unraveling over years of like the emotional abuse, the financial abuse, and then really her whole social destabilization. That was all ripped from her. And again, she helped shape Dan's life and his success. So it was, really torn from her. And all of that work she felt was for nothing. And her identity was completely collapsing. And Betty was raised to believe that her worth came from being this amazing wife and mother and supporter of her spouse. And her life really revolved around Dan's ambition and his success for their family. And when the marriage ended, her entire identity was completely dissolved. Something in that era, women were rarely supported in rebuilding. And that's really important to understand as well. And he was cutting her off from even being able to have basic needs, let alone paying for any sort of help emotionally or any sort of legal help. And this became chronic humiliation for her. The media mocked her relentlessly for her emotional outbursts. And really, they framed her as the hysterical woman. So again, if you look back in film history, as soon as a woman becomes emotional, she was viewed as irrational or hysterical or as a mad woman. But if you zoom out on this, she was somebody being really pushed past her limits and really removed from everything she built. Even her kids were being turned against her. Her finances were being restricted, and then her reputation was being shredded horrendously. Now, if we look at it from a perspective nowadays and understanding psych a little bit more than we did in the past, while she wasn't formally diagnosed, some psychologists later speculate that she might have had some narcissistic injury and some borderline traits. And borderline, they have this intense fear of abandonment and identity instability and emotional dysregulation. And she also probably had major depression from prolonged stress, and then the betrayal of the trauma, and then even the isolation she was suffering in their social circle and from her children and everything. And likely now we know more about complex PTSD from trauma. So she sustained a lot of degradation during this time after the divorce. So she's really this teeter between insanity from media perspective, from really when she was more broken down in a system that didn't have a language or any sort of compassion even at that time or empathy for this kind of mental deterioration after something this severe. Now, in the 80s, therapy was really stigmatized, especially for women. And women expressing rage or grief were often labeled as crazy or bitter or unstable. And there was so little awareness of emotional abuse or gaslighting or even narcissistic relationships at the time that it really wasn't part of mainstream psychology quite yet. Culture of divorce was shifting at the time, and the no-fault divorce era was just beginning. And the courts favored men, especially men who were powerful like Dan. And the good wives were expected to just hold the family together and silently just endure all of this. Women lost their role, and the sad part is that society really offered no roadmap for self-reconstruction at the time. So Betty's emotional collapse wasn't just personal. This was also a blind spot of how women were treated during this time when mental health and emotional labor were not recognized. Now, again, the media's coverage was double-edged sword with this. Now, here's where I find this so interesting. So, again, the media kind of started off with this whole villain narrative. The early coverage and the early portrayals of Betty was her as this scorned, jealous ex-wife who just snapped one day. And the headlines emphasized her as rageful, rather than looking at the years of emotional breakdown that led to the snapping. Now, in turn, she also kind of got this folk hero narrative. I would say this really probably started a little bit more years later once she started serving her times. Letters were pouring into the courts and prisons from women saying, listen, I understand your rage. I get it. I went through this. And people were really kind of encouraging her as the symbol of like the suppressed female anger. And so there was this whole dynamic of sensationalism versus empathy. The tabloid era at this time was absolutely thriving. So the networks played her up as this emotional, crazy woman who was hysterical, and instead of examining the system imbalance and this woman, rather than this woman who just couldn't let it go, this was somebody who was deeply upset and angered over years of trying to pour her heart into something that was fucking ripped from her. That part is not okay either. And when Dan and Betty first separated after 16 years of marriage, really Betty had no independent income. And she spent her adult life supporting his education while he was going through medical and law school. That would be so fucking hard. So to go over their finances, Dan reportedly was giving Betty about $9,000 per month in temporary support initially. That's a lot for the 80s. That number quickly shifted downward as legal battles intensified, and Betty later claimed that Dan manipulated court filings to reduce the payments and delay these proceedings purposefully, and this tactic kind of left her financially desperate. Now, if we look at the time, 1985-ish, $9,000 a month would equate, this is insane to me, equate to about $26,000 to $28,000 a month in today's realm. That sounds huge, but remember, they had 4 children to support and a lifestyle for a high-powered attorney in California. This was the cultural norm for them. Eventually, the court set formal spousal support, and that was around $16,000 per month, but that didn't last. Dan fought to reduce it further, and Betty's spending was scrutinized harshly. Now, Dan eventually reduced back to $9,000 a month, and then he cut her off entirely for a period. Then she had no access to funds to pay her mortgage, her lawyer fees, or even groceries at certain points. Now, during the final divorce, when the divorce was finalized in 1989, Betty received $28,000 in cash, plus an annual support payment of $16,000 per year. So that's just a little over $1,300 a month. And she also got a little bit of personal property, but this was a massive, massive downgrade from the life she helped Dan build. So again, if we're looking at it in today's terms, the $1,300 a month in 1989 would equate to about $3,200 a month in today's standards. That's about $38,000 a year in modern times. Yes. And for context, Dan's annual income at the time exceeded $1 million, which roughly about $2.5 to $3 million in today's terms. So Betty was left with about 1% to 2% of what she earned after having supported through 2 graduate degrees and working during that time to help him build that. Fuck that, right? So again, guys, this is why women today were told you have to go to college, you have to support yourself because of shit like this. Now, the financial manipulation, whether you see it as real or perceived, was very devastating psychologically for Betty. And it wasn't just about money. This was about power and identity. She spent decades being Mrs. Broderick and helping Dan build his empire behind the scenes, but then suddenly she was financially erased from a world that she helped create. And again, he used his influence in the San Diego legal community, and Betty really didn't feel like she had any sort of recourse, right? A lot of these came from, so just so you understand, a lot of this came from Until the 12th of Never, which was Bella Stumbo's 1993 book. And they had some detailed financial records. And then also in 1989, the Los Angeles Times reported a list of Dan's income and Betty's final settlement and such, just for some references. Now, the women's perspective of the time is thousands of women through the 80s, 70s and 80s faced this, okay? Now, again, way, way lower scale than what Betty endured because of, their financial stability and such. But this was after decades of unpaid domestic labor. these women were raising the babies, they were keeping the home, and they were losing financial security and even their children. And then they were being called crazy when they had emotional reactions to this. Women felt invisible and voiceless, especially in the court systems, which were being run by men in the old boys club. So most women didn't kill their ex-husbands, though, guys. And again, murder is not okay, but we do have to understand the despair and this rage and the depression that came from these cases. And Betty's was just a huge, explosive piece of this that allowed women to find words to explain it. And a lot of this became a cultural mirror. What happens when a woman gives everything to a system that offers her fucking nothing back? And it forced people to question, where is this line between being a victim and accountability? But how women's pain was, and often still is, minimized whenever things like this become catastrophic. This kind of blew the roof off that and started exposing this and, at least offering us words to explain it. Now today, we have language for something that Betty lived through that it didn't have a name at the time, and this is narcissistic abuse, gaslighting, and covert control. Instead of ending things compassionately, he gaslit her into lying about the affair that was so public and obvious even in the office. He had the law behind him. He had home. He had the kids eventually even. He got full custody. And she had nothing but fucking anger and rage. So while she appeared irrational and hysterical, that was how this narcissistic system plays out and thrives. And it is not okay. Historically, women who resisted unfair power structures were labeled as mad or hysterical and emotional. And as we talked in previous films, what the fuck happened to those women? Well, they had to be put in their place. There had to be justice, or there had to be some sort of fixing, right? They had to be silenced. And see what happens when you can't let it go. That, these people, they were part of a system of long-term suffocation and instability, and she represented the collective scream of women who'd been told to stay pretty and quiet and grateful and just sit down and be submissive and shut the fuck up. Her story still resonates today, guys. When you strip away the crime and you look through the trauma-informed lens of this, Betty's case is fucking tragic. It was emotional abuse hidden in plain sight, and there weren't words to describe any of this. Women's rage was seen as pathological instead of understood, and societal systems fail to protect women's mental health until they break. Now, there's a parallel that I want to discuss in depth. One, going back, I wanted to go back to a very old case that, again, we talk about media shifts and everything else. But I did a report on this individual back in college, so I was really excited to see this come back up through research as somebody who was painted in a completely different light through a media circus. And that is the 1927 case of the jazz-age femme fatale, Ruth Snyder. And Ruth was a Long Island housewife, and after years of a loveless marriage, she and her lover at the time ended up murdering her husband. So, the case, like I said, was media frenzy, and she was painted as this vain, cold-hearted adulteress. And the biggest thing that most people would remember of this is there was a hidden camera that was taken into her execution and actually captured her execution in the electric chair. And this was what ended up being just pasted across the headlines of the newspapers at the time and headlines. So just looking really quick, some of the parallels, Ruth's emotional state was never explored initially. She was only looked at as immoral. And in the 20s, press thrived on sensationalism at the time, especially when it came to women who defied any sort of domestic roles. Like Betty, Ruth symbolized female rebellion turned monstrous under the patriarchal gaze, okay? So, Ruth Brown Snyder, she was born in 1895 and she died in 1928 in Queens, New York. She was a housewife who, along with her lover Henry Gray, conspired to kill Albert Snyder, who was Ruth's husband. The murder happened in 1927. Now, Ruth ended up claiming that her husband was very abusive and controlling, and she took multiple life insurance policies out on him, and some with double indemnity clauses, meaning she would get a double payout for an accidental death. Okay, so this is another piece of this case. It's not just so much that she murdered, but there was this piece of it. So that part was ruthless, okay? But she and Gray, her lover, then attempted to stage his death as a burglary gone wrong. Now, police immediately grew suspicious. They noticed Ruth's behavior was inconsistent, and clues like a monogrammed cigarette case and a moved window screen led the detective straight to knowing that it was her and Gray. Okay. The trial in 1927 became a media circus, as it was one of the first of its kind. Okay. The press coverage, the news media sensationalized every detail of Ruth's life. They sensationalized her looks, her love affair. They scrutinized clothing and even her expressions in court. Okay. She was portrayed as this vampish seductress who was this cold-blooded killer, and she fed into society's fear of independence or immoral women in the 20s. So the thing that's funny is Henry, the co-conspirator, in turn was completely depicted as this meek, manipulated man who, through evidence, showed he was fully complicit with Ruth. So it's so interesting how the media completely pitted these people into two separate categories when they did nearly the same thing, right? But they were both sentenced to death. They both ended up dying by electric chair. Now, Ruth was electrocuted on January 12th, 1928, and she was executed at the Sing Sing prison. She was the first woman executed in New York in over a decade at that point. This made the case legendary as a secret photograph was taken at the moment of her execution by Tom Howard, who was a New York Daily News photographer, and he snapped a hidden camera with his ankles. Now, these weren't these little tiny cameras back then because these were pretty big. But the next day, the front page of the paper screamed "dead" in all caps with an exclamation point, with the shocking image of Ruth Snyder's body in the electric chair, which is one of the most infamous newspaper photos in history. This was marked as a whole turning point in tabloid journalism, and public fascination with crime and death really just took off at this point. But if you go back and you look at the mental health and gender perspective of the Ruth Snyder case, it's actually very revealing. So there was some in the 20s, women in the 20s had limited autonomy, okay? Ruth's affair and actions, while criminal, can also be read through the lens of emotional desperation of this patriarchal oppression. Societal death standards, Gray was seen as weak and redeemable, but Ruth was painted as this inherently evil femme fatale, which at the time was a huge female role in the film industry as well. The media, with her story, was used to sell papers and shape public opinion about women's morality and criminality, with little understanding of the trauma, the mental illness, or domestic abuse that women especially were enduring at the time. Now, many historians now suggest Ruth may have been reacting a deep emotional confinement in this role, rather than one of these, the one of her just being this crazy woman who just wanted to have money and have an affair. There's no concrete evidence, though, that Albert, her husband, ever really physically abused her, but there were very strong contextual clues from testimony, witness accounts, and social attitudes at the time that there was immense emotional, psychological, and even verbal abuse that were factors in their marriage. And in Ruth's own claim, she said, "He never cared for me, only that other dead woman." And this was in reference to Albert's late fiancée who had died before he married Ruth. And he reportedly kept a picture hanging of this ex-fiancée who had passed in their home. And Ruth claimed that even tortured her. She claimed he consistently criticized her looks, her clothing, and her housekeeping skills, and he forbade her from certain friends and activities, which is very telling of narcissistic abuse. And he also belittled her intelligence and controlled her finances very tightly. So this does all align with psychological abuse, even back then. Now, the treatment back then was completely normalized because this was just how marriages were at the time. But it's important to understand that. Now, accounts of Albert's personality from friends and people who knew Albert described him as very moody. They described him as self-righteous, rigid. He was deeply traditional and authoritarian. And one quote even said, "a man who wanted order and obedience." And we now know that this order and compliance and obedience in women has been looked at over the years. So it's interesting to go back and look and see at the time that they really just didn't have a whole lot of say over things like this. A lot of the times they would just say, "Oh, that's how he is." Now, co-workers at Motorboating Magazine is where Albert worked. So his co-workers portrayed him as very uptight and conservative, and not the sort of man to inspire love. No one really reported any sort of outright physical violence, but they did note that his personality fits the archetype of a controlling controlling husband in a repressed marriage, especially in the 20s when women had little legal or social power to challenge anything in that dynamic. And honestly, divorce back then was almost unheard of. It was very tough. But it was insightful that Ruth, predates the Betty Broderick by 6 decades, yet both women's stories echo the same cultural script. If you betray, you're going to be publicly humiliated. Women were given no dignity or outlet for these breakdowns, right? So, divorce in the time of Ruth Snyder in the 20s, America's in the 1920s, she really had no outlet, okay? Divorce was extremely difficult to obtain before the 1930s. The grounds were narrow, and the burden of proof was also on the spouse filing, and the evidence had to be public, humiliating, and often corroborated by witnesses. So even if it was attainable, which was not really, especially in, without having any sort of financial clout, so even if their marriage was miserable, most women couldn't leave without being shamed or financially destroyed. Now, in the 20s, they were still kind of following these Victorian moral codes. So divorce was essentially associated with moral failure, and that was especially put on women at the time. The religious institution, especially for Catholic and Protestant marriages, were seen as sacred, and you were not to break them. A divorced woman was often seen as a fallen woman, like she had some sort of moral taintedness about her, that they were unfit for polite society and unfit for remarriage even. And if they had children, they were seen as a bad mother if they had a failed marriage. And this was even through the Roaring 20s, which was bringing out flappers and jazz music and the sense of liberation for women at the time when this freedom was only surface level. Women were still expected to stay loyal and quiet and domesticated, sadly. Now, women couldn't really survive alone at the time either. Most middle-class women didn't work outside of the home. Divorce could strip them of any sort of financial security or social status, and alimony wasn't guaranteed or even standardized, but the courts anyways typically favored men at that time. So for somebody like Ruth Snyder, she was really trapped in this loveless, oppressed marriage, and divorce was going to be seen as scandalous and economically catastrophic. Now again, murder is not okay and it's wrong, but I think these cases are so important because there's such a parallel in women's breaking points, and it's so important to understand. And we now know that there are ways out, luckily. But they were, in Ruth's situation, her husband Albert was reportedly very cold and controlling and emotionally cruel. He idolized his deceased fiancée, which keeping a photo in their home for years is really kind of humiliating, especially for a woman at that time. And she began an affair with this salesman, Henry Drew Gray, and more likely probably just trying to seek some personal validation. Again, also not right, but at the time and in the desperation, none of this excuses or crime, but it does understand the emotional, psychological trap, okay? Then, once this all happened, the press completely vilified Ruth in her gender and moralistic terms. They called her the blonde fiend, which fiend is so funny to me, guys, because my grandma used to say that when she was mad at us. She would call us fiends. The ice woman and the tramp wife. And the same public that secretly sympathized with her trap situation also punished her for rebelling it, especially through the violence, right? So women may suffer silently, but they must not transgress. Now, as far as looking at these, Snyder versus Broderick, Snyder was in the 1920s, Broderick 1980s, and their divorce stigma, Ruth, in Snyder's case, it would have been seen as immoral and nearly impossible, while Betty Broderick's was still stigmatized, but especially with her Catholic upbringing and culture. That was really harsh on both of them. Economic power, Snyder was dependent on her husband, and Broderick was legally entitled to support, but often manipulated, so that was really, really tough on her as well. In the female role, Snyder was a silent homemaker. Broderick was an educated wife and mother, but she was still bound to her husband's success. And both of them, their divorce would be their ruination, their complete collapse. The public judgment on this, they would call Snyder this murderous tramp, and they called Broderick his crazy ex-wife. So with the cultural mirror of Ruth Snyder through modern trauma and informed lens, she wasn't a femme fatale. She was really a trapped woman in the times that gave her no moral or legal way out. And divorce in her era wasn't just taboo, it was social death sentence. And the moral code at the time was a good woman would suffer in silence and a bad one would fight back. So society really punished both. And this is a psychological state where long-term suppression and emotional abuse cause impulsive decisions that are very self-destructive. She had symptoms of depression and dependency, and she didn't have really any other outlet for her distress. And therapy and women's advocacy at the time really didn't exist, especially in her social class at the time. So the media's role in silencing her in the 20s, the press mocked her and they villainized Ruth. And instead of investigating her claims, the headlines just labeled her. Now, modern criminologists and historians often interpret Ruth as a product of patriarchal oppression, trapped in a loveless, possibly emotionless, abusive marriage with no legal way out. And a woman experienced emotional collapse, not an inherently evil killer. That evidence showed that there was emotional and verbal abuse, and it's probable but not verified. Now, by the 20s, the tabloid boom had fully taken over the United States in journalism, and the New York Daily News and Daily Mirror competed for circulation with these really lurid headlines at the times. They really fought with showing crime photos and melodramatic type of information. So when Ruth's case dropped right into this climate, the editors just saw financial gold and not a person. They didn't portray Ruth as a human being. They made her a symbol, really. Her trial became a source of entertainment rather than a source of justice. And this really framed as a warning that this is what happens to women when they step out of their fucking place, right? Now, in the courtroom in 1927, women had technically gained the right to vote, which was in 1920, but marriage laws and gender rules, they weren't caught up yet. And at this point, laws for marriage and gender just hadn't caught up yet. In the courtroom, Ruth was heavily chastised for showing emotion and was called hysterical for that. And for not showing enough emotion then, in the other whole axis of this, she was called cold and unfeeling. Now, Henry Judd Gray received way more sympathy, because this whore Jezebel came out and seduced him, talked him into killing the husband, even though that probably was not the case. But the judge allowed salacious testimony about Ruth's affair, but dismissed the descriptions of emotional neglect as irrelevant. So those were kicked out. So her humanity wasn't really admissible in court, sadly. And she was just seen as an evil seductress. At this time, psychiatry had just been emerging, and women's hysteria was still a catch-all diagnosis. Women's pain and rage was pathological instead of understood. So no one in the courtroom, no lawyers, the journalists, not even her defense team used terms like trauma, repression, or emotional abuse because they weren't terms that were used back then. And the public had an appetite for scandal at the time too. It's so critical to understand that the 20s were a time for this cultural whiplash. Women's fashion was becoming a little more freer in this flapper generation. Sexuality was rapidly evolving right after World War I. Here's the thing that society feared at the time. Ruth embodied all of this. She had an affair. She lied to her husband. She challenged domestic submission. So her execution was almost a way to order law and compliance to those who wanted to escape that type of living. And then her photo. The photo of her dying in the electric chair was a symbol of this is what happens to women who step the fuck out of their place. So sadly, her voice really was disappeared from history, and anything that you really look up on Ruth at quick glance is that she was just this cold-blooded killer. But after her execution, Ruth was reduced to this caricature in books and in plays, and most notably, James N. Cain did Double Indemnity in 1936, and it was a fictionalized version of her as this calculating seductress. So again, guys, this is not new. In the early 90s, when Meredith Baxter played Betty Broderick, they come up with these quick films and narratives, and it really shapes your reality of what happened. The problem is they didn't add the nuance of her psychological torment, any of the social repression that was going on, or this emotional void, which was completely erased from Ruth. Now, again, until the 70s through the 90s revisited her story, anybody that really questioned what was going on, it finally pointed out that the press used sexism as a spectacle, the court punished non-compliance in gender roles, and culture preferred a dead woman to one that was going to be complicated and non-compliant. Now, and there's a clear through line from Ruth Snyder all the way to modern cases when women commit crimes, is that the media and the public automatically frame it through this gendered, moralistic lens rather than exploring context, trauma, and mental health. Now, again, Ruth and Betty Broderick kind of echo one another because, like Ruth, Betty was cast as this dangerous, emotional woman, and she was created into this public spectacle rather than a human being who had context behind her actions. Society treats violent women as morality tales or entertainment rather than human beings who suffered through something and acted out, even though inappropriately. They remove that whole portion of it. Perspectives are slowly gaining ground, but sensationalism is still dominant in our headlines, and that's why we still have like Us Weekly and things like that in the tabloids that are still being sold constantly. So Ruth Snyder really was the one who set the template, and that's why I wanted to kind of piece these two cases together in this episode, because this was such a media-saturated case where a woman's crime was framed for the spectacle and the sex, and they completely erased her humanity, where, this continues to go through high-profile cases to follow, such as Betty Broderick's case. And just found both of these so fascinating because of the context and because I myself have seen how women have been treated through the years through media and whatnot. And having been shaped by a lot of this, we need to do better. And that's really my goal and what I hope that we can start calling attention to in this podcast, guys. So I hope you have the best day, best week. And we'll see you next week for another episode. Bye.